I'd like to welcome everyone to the Board of County Commissioners Policy Session. Today we're talking about land use housing strategies, this big project we have going. Gary, would you like to tee it up?
Yes, Chair Smith, thank you. First, Commissioner Fisher is online, Commissioner Schrader is out of the office, and Commissioners Shull, Savas, and Chair Smith are here in the hearing room. This is a 2-hour planning session with you, Commissioners, on the topic of Land Use Housing Strategies Project. Our staff from Transportation and Development, Planning and Zoning Division will present and have a conversation with you. They are Jennifer Hughes, Karen Burig, Martha Fritzie. Please go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry, Chair Smith, you wanted to start.
Yeah, this is a very comprehensive, well put together presentation from our staff. They have parsed out the recommended motions. If the board decides to do that, I recommend, or in fact, I'm going to insist that we follow staff recommendations on motions today, and each one will be discussed thoroughly. I do not want to see one overarching, reaching out motion to do this today, because it's very technical work. Okay, with that in mind, staff, who's up first?
I'm going to start with just a brief introduction. Good morning, Chair, Commissioners, and Administrator Schmidt. I'm Jennifer Hughes. I'm the Planning Director. With me today are Karen Burig, our Long-Range Planning Manager, and Martha Fritzie, Principal Planner and Project Manager for the Land Use Housing Strategies Project,
Wow.
Which is what we are here to talk to you about today. It is kind of a mouthful, and as you noted, complicated and detailed work. We have 2 hours today for this session, and we have proposed that we do that, next slide please, in 3 parts. And we've got suggested timeframes for those, so we should be able to cover all the material within the allotted time. Part A is slated for 30 minutes, and staff hopes to keep our presentation to about 10 minutes. And this is really about the why for this project. So this is how did we get here, background, so that all of the board will have kind of that same baseline of information that we're operating under for this project. Then we would move to Part B, which is the area where we're really looking for direction from the board today. So we've slated an hour for that, again with about up to 20 minutes for the staff presentation, maybe a little bit less than that. That's to discuss phase 1 of our proposed housing strategies. These are strategies that we're hoping will increase housing supply and affordability. And we are, as I said, asking for direction from the board on that, and we'll talk about specifics when we get to Part B. And then Part C is also informational. Again, suggested 30 minutes there, about 10 minutes for the staff presentation and the rest for board discussion. And that is to talk about phase 2 of the proposed housing strategies, which is primarily work that's required by the state of Oregon. And it has about a 1-year time frame where we'll need to come into compliance with those standards. And so with that, just wanted to set the stage, I'm going to turn it over now to Karen Burig to move into Part A.
Good morning, Commissioners. So I'm going to keep my eye on the slide. So tackling the challenge of providing more opportunities for affordable housing to be available is a very complex task. It requires actions from both the Department of Health, Housing, and Human Services, as well as DTD. And these actions address different elements of the issue and have different impacts across the spectrum of the housing continuum. So on this slide, it basically is showing this relationship between the fact that H3S are doing some actions, and then DTD are doing actions. So today, we're focusing on the DTD actions. So next slide. So since 2017, there's been a variety of requirements and recommendations that set the foundation for the information that we're going to talk to you about today. One of the key things is the housing needs analysis. So that was completed in 2019, and it's included as an attachment. I believe it's attachment A3 in all of your materials. And this was supported by C4. Doing that housing needs analysis was supported, and it was managed out of the county administration office. The key takeaways from the housing needs analysis is that housing is increasingly less affordable. There's a limited supply of residential land, and that there is a need for more than 5,000 more housing units in the urban unincorporated area of Clackamas County. So those are some of the key takeaways from that. So that also includes, it's not just single-family homes, but it includes multifamily homes. It includes the fact that this housing needs to be affordable, available in varying sizes and types and costs.
Excellent.
So that's the housing needs assessment analysis. Next slide. So another key input to the work that we're going to be talking about today are the recommendations made by the Housing Affordability and Homelessness Task Force. And that task force was underway between 2018 and 2019. And the full report from that task force is included as attachment A4. And the task force was appointed by the board, and it made recommendations for actions that address affordability, include strategies for funding, housing services, et cetera. So included on this slide are the specific recommendations related to the DTD actions. So they made recommendations that H3S is following up on, and so then they also made recommendations pertaining to DTD. So we're just talking about the DTD ones today. And so those include tiered density bonus for affordable housing, increased maximum density for multifamily, a hierarchy of parking standards, and the ability for shelter off the streets housing. So those came from this Housing Affordability and Homelessness Task Force. So next slide, if I'm on the row here. So in addition to the Housing Affordability and Homelessness Task Force recommendations, there have been state mandates related to actions to be taken to increase the housing supply. There are the board performance clackamas standards and direction for DTD to provide zoning for places for 700 new dwelling units. And there was also input received during the 2019 to 21 long-range planning work program that kind of gave direction onto issues related to housing. So to organize and develop a proposal on how we approach all of this, staff came together and they created an issue paper, again, as one of your attachments. It's attachment A2, and that was presented to the board back in February of 2020. And so that outlined kind of an approach to all of these different recommendations and how we would look at those. So where are we? And so the next slide. And so here is this high-level approach for what was discussed with the board back in 2020. One, that we would break it into different phases. So we would break these strategies. There were 11 strategies that emerged, and we proposed to look at sets of those strategies over time. So as we talked about, under phase 1 strategies, which we have been looking at and working on since spring of 2020, and we'll discuss those in detail in Part A. Those were grouped together. And then there were a set of phase 2 strategies. There were about 3 strategies included there. Those were highly influenced by state mandates. That we'll talk about in Part C. And then phase 3, which was another set of these strategies, was like, once we're done with phase 1 and 2, let's go back to the board, figure out if we still need to be making further actions. So that's the approach, and that approach is kind of outlined in that issue paper. So next slide, please. And so this gives you an idea, this is a map of the impacted areas. So in general, the red areas are the commercial and multifamily zones, and those are the ones that are primarily impacted by the phase 1 strategies. The area that is hatched are more the single-family zones, and those are mostly impacted by the phase 2 strategies. So that kind of sets in your mind the impact of where these strategies would impact. And these are really focused in the urban unincorporated area. So that's something else to just kind of keep in mind.
Excuse me, I need a point of clarification,
Yes.
Karen. The red that is crosshatched, you said was commercial zones and?
So the red that is in here,
Yes?
and it has the crosshatch over it, yes.
Yes.
Those are generally our commercial and multifamily zones.
Okay.
The ones that are just crosshatched, no red,
Okay, stop.
yes,
On the red,
yes,
commercial in unincorporated Clackamas County?
correct.
Okay, continue.
Okay.
Chair.
So,
Yeah, Paul, go ahead.
I had my light on. I just want to point out that another way to look at those red zones is, those are jobs.
I know that, and I'm going to make a point about that later, and I knew you would say that, Commissioner Savas, and thank you. Please continue.
next slide. And so actually, with this slide, that concludes the presentation for the overview portion. Kind of provides you with a background. This portion was informational only. We're not asking you for additional direction at this point, but we're here to see if the board has any questions about this. And I guess I'm going to pass it back over to Jennifer at this point to help facilitate the questions, if needed.
So, I mean, I think that
Any comments?
it's to you, Chair, if you
Well,
have general.
Yeah, and in this, on my sheet, and, Commissioner Savas makes the point, on page 2, there's a section here that says, well, where did that go? It talks about, oh, yeah, on the green part, Phase 1 in the green, the number 3rd, it says, consider increasing, removing maximum density requirements for multifamily developments in commercial zoning districts. Well, what are we going to do about our jobs? And I don't understand why we would be, we have very little industrial land in Clackamas County. We have very little job-producing lands in Clackamas County, and therefore we have trouble attracting businesses to come here. Paul, why would we put multi-density, low-income housing and take away that wonderful land for our jobs?
Well, this is where, as staff have said, it's actually a very complex issue, but Dan, I think, and other people in economic development would appreciate that we are where we are because of market forces. I mean, the market has developed who we are, and if you look at these corridors, you look at the businesses on them, a lot of them are service-oriented. They provide services, shopping, things that people need. Market-driven, logical. For the most part, sure, some of them can look prettier, some of them could be redeveloped and all of that. But it was not too long ago, Chair, that and colleagues, that the region suddenly had this relook, or Metro had this relook and say, you know what, we should really make our infrastructure sweat, literally. And so I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but the whole idea was instead of growing where we need to grow and providing an infrastructure, let's just make the internal part sweat. Well, the problem with that is that we are seeing land prices and property values go up and up and up, and that has caused, I think, a different market force, and I think it's caused a lot of lack of opportunity for new jobs because we're a growing population. So that's a great theory. But if you look around and see how that's working for us, land values, property values have increased, rents have gone. I don't think it's working. I had problems with it then. I have problems with it now, and we're sitting on thousands of acres in the UGB that is urban, technically, that is sitting out to the east, east of the industrial area, Happy Valley, Damascus area, that we could be capitalizing on growth. And redevelopment causes a lot of neighborhood friction. I'll just use Park Avenue as an example, as just one of those. And we are going to displace businesses and jobs. And we have more people coming in. We need more jobs. And we're the county with the highest amount of people leaving the county every day to go to work. Yeah. That is a problem, and if we keep on adding housing and we don't add a proportional amount of jobs and job opportunities, we are going to make that even worse.
Yeah,
so
I
if we
would
actually
agree.
are climate conscious, if we are transportation conscious, we would be growing everything within the county and not displacing it and saying, too bad, so sad. You have no place to grow, you have no place to go. We'll say that again. You have no place to grow and you have no place to go. And that is something we need to address.
I do think we need to address that in this. I don't like the fact, and maybe my other commissioners can weigh in, we have this huge, we don't like the fact that we could be using commercial job-producing lands for affordable housing, high-density housing. We need to be mindful, not only are we a net exporter of our people commuting outside to work, we are a net exporter of the goods we produce. Just think about, for instance, in the farming initiative that this board approved of, the question I posed to commissioners was, do you think in Clackamas County we should grow enough food, be able to grow enough food to feed ourselves? That's really important, and the same theory goes along with this. Don't you think that we should have enough employment jobs in Clackamas County to employ ourselves? And obviously that answer is no. Where I appreciate this huge, freight train of the Metro housing bond running over the top of us, and dictating to every which way we turn with that, I'm still going to stand and try to protect our jobs. And I think, if there was any learning opportunity in the Park Avenue situation, my opinion, there's nothing wrong with car dealerships. Those are high-paying jobs. It's high-value real estate. They pay a lot of taxes into Clackamas County. And if they go away, where are they going to go? I mean, Multnomah County doesn't want them. I mean, people in Clackamas County buy cars all the time. Because we live in such rural areas, our cars are probably more sought after than in Beaverton because of the mileage we put on them. So I want staff, unless I hear objections from my commissioners, I want staff to think about preserving our commercial, industrial jobs lands in our quest on moving forward for affordable housing. And if we have to take a vote on it, we can take a vote on it or not. And I'm not sure how this philosophy fits in with the motions that we've been asked to do. And people in the room can help us nuance that. Commissioners, Mark, you have any thoughts on this?
The balance between residential housing and commercial activity zones is a good thing. The balance is a good thing if you have enough housing to support X number of jobs in that commercial zone, so people can walk to work. That's the beauty of it. But if the number of residential units in that commercial zone totally outweighs the requirement for jobs, what happens is we get the kind of friction we see in the Park Avenue development. That is friction between business and residential uses, where it becomes more of a residential area than it is a commercial area, and that becomes a problem.
Commissioner Fisher.
Thank you, Chair Smith. I really appreciate this conversation because looking at the whole picture is very, very important, especially when we have limited employment lands. But I would really like us to have really solid information. I'm hearing from many of our employers that they need workforce. And we saw with the pandemic when we hit the high unemployment rates of how quickly that changes when the economy starts to open again. So I just want to make sure that whatever types of decisions we're making, it's based on the latest information about what our employers need. And one thing we know from many sectors is that workforce housing is critical. It just does not exist in Clackamas County. So in order for our employers that we have currently to be vibrant and effective, they need their employees to have housing that they can afford. And that is definitely a problem.
Commissioner Savas.
Yeah. Just real quickly, I don't want to disagree with Commissioner Fisher, but let's just talk about the balance, and I'll just come back to my point. So we are heavily imbalanced, where we have far more households and more housing per capita than any other county in the region. And so our workforce housing, contrary, again, maybe it's opinion, but I think facts are facts. Maybe we should look into that. But we have an abundance of workforce housing, so to speak, in the sense that, we have all ranges. We need more of this and more of that, and we need more of all of it. I'm not disagreeing with any of that. But we have a lot of workforce housing. We are the workforce. That's why people leave every day to go to work. They live here because we have it. So I think having the latest information is important. I agree with Commissioner Fisher on that, but I think we need to have all of the information. So workforce, our Economic Development Commission meeting this morning, the biggest realization right now that all of these layoffs due to the COVID restrictions and these waves we experienced, the workforce, they have their employees, and then they get laid off, and then those employees, they want to work, so they find a job somewhere else. That business loses that trained workforce. So the workforce thing is huge. I agree with that completely. But it just goes to show, I think, that when we talk about the balance, we need to realize who we are. We are a housing, we are a suburban county. We are heavy in homes. We are weak in jobs and employment. That's where we need to grow. I think we need to grow everything, but we need to remember who we are. And that imbalance is what we need to work on. So that's why that gateway, the Sunrise Corridor Gateway, that land to the east, by design, was designed to answer all of our, well, not all of our problems, but a lot of these challenges. We have the opportunity to get that. And if we don't want, this is a deep topic, but I'll just stop there.
And Commissioner Savas, I share your passion for this. I really do. I have a little story for you. I have a friend who lives in San Diego, and do we want to become like Southern California? And there's a suburb, and San Diego is really spread out. I think San Diego County is the nation's 8th largest county. And there's a good reason, because the weather's 80 degrees every day. Holy cow. And I like to go down in the winter because of that. But she lives in a town, in a suburb called Poway. And Poway is this cute little place, and it used to be cuter than it is now, but people move there because of affordable housing. And you can drive literally 3 minutes out and get to a horse farm and go ride a horse. That's how wonderful it is. However, a lot of professionals have gone there, and they have 2 sections of Poway. They call it Rich Poway and they call it Poor Poway. Well, in Poor Poway, you can buy an 1,100 square foot ranch-style home that was built in 1970 for $800,000. And they have affordable homes in this, and they have lower-priced homes that you have to qualify for. And those lower-priced homes are for, are you ready for this, people? Teachers, police, and fire. Because if they do not provide housing, they're not going to get any teachers to teach their kids in school, they're not going to get any police to monitor their crime, and they're not going to get a fire department to send out the medical and fire needs. Do we want to do that? I don't even know how we do that in Oregon. I don't think that's ever been done before, to select certain professions that we need to apply affordable housing to. I think, I mean, you know, when I just saw that, and I drove by these neighborhoods when I was down there, they're nice houses. But somehow they were able to build them probably half a market. So our fire and teacher and police could afford to buy a home and raise their own families in the area. So going forward in our quest to create, I'm not even sure what we're creating here. Seriously, I'm not sure, because the freight train of Metro is coming, okay. And it's supposed to fix a problem, help fix a problem. I just want us to be cognizant of my Poway, California story as we move forward. Up next, any other commissioner comments?
Yeah, just one thing. Going back to the map that shows the red that we pointed out earlier. I mean, I'm not saying there's any mistake or anything, but if we had a map of the entire urbanized portion of the county, I'd like to see another color in there, being green. And the green is opportunity for those jobs in those places. And that's, if we knew where we could grow and we could see that visually on the same map, I think that would help depict and people comprehend the opportunity we have to solve this imbalance, provide the economic activity and the opportunity, and build housing as well.
Yeah, that might be a good opportunity for us. It might take some time from staff to do, Paul. I mean, I don't know, maybe the information's there, maybe it's not, I don't know. Any other comments or questions from commissioners? Can we move on to the next part of the presentation?
I just want one thing I want to add.
Yeah.
Just to validate what we're saying, these numbers that I'm giving you, or I'm not giving you numbers, but this information I'm giving you is embedded in the Metro plan. Can you speak to that, Jennifer? When we did our look at the Sunrise Corridor for that opportunity, they have planned densities for all that. What do they call that? Is it the comprehensive plan?
You're talking about the metro level?
At the Metro level, yeah.
So they're either Metro 2040 or their urban growth management functional plan. I'm saying that wrong. But anyway, their urban growth management plan, or they've got different documents that kind of get at those same issues. So I'm not sure exactly.
Right. When we did our work for the Gateway, we wanted to use Metro's own numbers for the job forecasting, the forecasting for housing and jobs and
Right.
everything. So we use Metro's forecasting for that. So we could put valid stuff in there. We're not making this up. This
Yeah,
is
no,
this is
Paul,
valid data.
I know we're not making this up. I just think moving forward, we need to preserve our important employment lands. Yeah, I don't care if there's a little bit of housing in there, whatever. Commissioner Scholl makes the point, on that. But if, you know, when I saw the red with a crosshash, I'm going, oh dear, and I see this this statement here, number 3 in the green section. I thought, oh, no, I don't want to do that. So can you understand what I'm saying? We're all saying.
Yes, I do. So
Thank
I think
you.
this is a good segue to Part B, which is where we are going to talk very specifically about the strategies in Phase 1, 3 of which would apply in commercial zones. Now, there's also some impact in multifamily, but in our commercial corridors, and that was one of the strategies that we were asked to look at. And I'm certainly hearing some resistance, which is why we're here, is to find out if you're supportive of moving forward with this or not. And so Martha can speak to this in a little more detail in terms of the changes that are being proposed. And I think, you've captured it really well. This is about trade-offs. It's about taking a limited supply of urban land and multiple needs and figuring out how we balance that. And so initially, our charge was to find a place to put potentially up to 5,000 dwelling units over 20 years. That's the forecast. But it's not to say we don't need jobs. So the question is where? Where do those houses go? And that's really what this project is looking at. So with that, I'd be happy to have Martha get started on the details of Part B if
Please
you're ready.
do, Jennifer.
Yeah, I
Thank
just
you.
want-
Thank
if
you
I
for
could just
listening.
add One last thing.
Please be brief.
Yeah,
We
I'll
need
be
to move
super
this
brief,
along.
is that-
We're already at the half-hour
Whenever we
mark.
had this discussion about how properties are zoned and zoning and industrial land, Commissioner Bernard at the time would always say, go back to the Seinfeld episode where keep the reservation, preserve the land as it's zoned. Keep the reservation, don't change it or shift it. So that was something he had said often. That was his analogy using that Seinfeld episode, just keep the reservation. Reserve that land or that zoning for that purpose.
Okay, go ahead. Thank you. Martha, please.
Next slide, please. Thanks. So as Jennifer mentioned, I'm going to talk about Phase 1 of the Housing Strategies Project. Phase 1 actually includes 4 strategies, looking at potentially increasing multifamily densities allowed in certain commercial zones. Also looking at potentially making some changes to the parking requirements for multifamily dwellings. And that would be multifamily dwellings developed anywhere in the urban area, not only in commercial zones, in multifamily zones as well. And by parking requirements, we mean the number of parking spaces that are required to be constructed per unit. So in other words, if somebody was to build a 100-unit apartment complex, they might be required to put in 150 parking spaces. And so I can talk about that in a little bit more detail in a minute. We're also looking at potentially changing our affordable housing bonus and specifically the density housing bonus. So in other words, if a developer came in and said, hey, I'm building this development with affordable housing, can I get a few more units in there? And so under our current code, we do allow for a small density bonus over the base allowance of what's allowed in that zone. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then the last one is looking at regulations for transitional shelters. And Jennifer's going to take over that conversation when I'm done talking about the first 3. And so, next slide, please. We packaged the first 3 strategies together largely because they affect each other. They're directly related when it comes to development, and also because they really generally affect the same geographic area of the county. And so about a year ago, we started working on these 3 strategies, and like most planning projects, we start with doing a whole bunch of research. We look at what other jurisdictions are doing and how they regulate these things, because we're not looking to recreate the wheel here necessarily if there's a really good model out there. We also did a lot of research to what the data is telling us, because we had heard from developers that we need different parking ratios, we need different densities, and we say, okay, but really do we? And so we look for data and information to provide us some real numbers to fall back on when we're looking at these. We also did a fair amount of outreach, which was interesting, trying to backpedal and do outreach online to people, and it was an interesting experiment, and we think it actually went pretty well. We did a pretty sizable outreach effort through press releases, social media, through our webpage. We, staff presented to a number of different bodies, a number of CPO meetings, the community leaders meetings, other presentations. We, this winter, had an online survey related to those 3 the 3 strategies in Phase 1. and got 573 responses, which is pretty good for an online survey. And we also put together a technical working group of 16 to 18 folks, citizens, developers, architects, housing providers, and other people, other experts in the field or interested parties, to bounce some of these ideas off of them and discuss what community needs and other needs might be. And staff then did some analysis and development of the recommendations that you see in your packet. Next slide, please. And so before I start getting into the detail of each of these three strategies, a couple things that we've been trying to keep in mind as we are thinking about these, and that I hope you all will keep in mind as you're thinking about these, is that when you look at development, there are a lot of things that affect how many housing units or even how much commercial development could be actually developed on a property. And for housing, it does include the number of units you're allowed to build, the maximum density. But parking is very directly related to that as well. Because if there's physically not space for parking, for surface parking, you have to do structured parking, which we all know is very expensive. Other development standards, setbacks, landscaping, other standards affect how much is actually developed on a property. And then certainly construction costs. We are told, I am not a developer, but certainly for housing, once you get above a certain number of stories, which I think is about 5, it requires a different construction type, and it gets extremely expensive. And then we also wanted to consider health outcomes and climate change. Housing affects both negatively and positively to some extent, health outcomes and climate change, and that's something we've tried to keep in the forefront of our mind as we've worked through this. And then finally, really no single strategy in this Housing Strategies project is going to solve our problems. And so we are looking at all of these strategies with the hope that it's not really a focus on one neighborhood or one area, but really that any impacts, positive or negative, are dispersed throughout the urban area, and that each strategy is going to help move the needle, but not solve our problems. Next slide. So the first strategy, increasing multifamily development in commercial zones. And we've already started talking about this a little bit, but I think it's important to have a little bit of context before we make a decision on this. And so specifically what we are looking at are 4 different commercial zones in our urban area. Now, in our urban area, there's a number of different commercial zones. Some of them allow housing and don't have a density cap, and those are found generally near the Clackamas Town Center and up by Fuller Road Station. There is no cap on how much housing could be built there. There are the zones that we are looking at that are found primarily along our corridors, as was identified in the red in that map. And those actually allow housing right now. So all the commercial zone, nearly all the commercial zone along, say, McLaughlin or 82nd, would allow multifamily housing. There is a cap right now of 25 units an acre. So you can only put 25 units per acre on those lands. We have heard both from the task force through the information provided in the housing needs analysis, and from the community and from developers, that more housing needs to be allowed, particularly in commercial zones. And the reason I say particularly in commercial zones is that the housing needs analysis found that our high-density housing land is nearly depleted. And so I guess the natural conclusion from that, at least in my mind, is there's going to be more pressure to provide multifamily housing in other areas that allow multifamily housing. Well, those are commercial zones, and we've already seen increased interest in some of our commercial zones to provide this housing. But to make housing feasible financially, we have been told that it's important to be able to provide a little bit higher density or a lot higher density, depending on who you talk to, than the 25 units an acre. And I'll stop here and just backtrack a little bit. Also in our commercial zones, mixed-use development is currently allowed. You could build housing and commercial on the same property. Nothing that we would be proposing with this would change that allowance. Commercial uses and housing could still be built. We don't see a lot of here in the county, admittedly, but all of those things are still on the table. This is not taking away uses. It would be potentially increasing the number of housing units that would be allowed to build on this land.
Okay, are you done?
I'm done with this slide, but go
Okay,
ahead.
good.
Yeah, that's,
I want to make a comment based on something you said.
uh-huh.
I have no problem increasing the amount of units. I've always thought that was, a bit archaic. But you said high-density lands are being depleted. So how do we create more high-density lands that are not in the commercial zone? Are we limited by state land use zoning on that?
Not in the urban area. We wouldn't be able to do it in the rural areas.
Does that make sense?
You could, yes, you could create more high-density
So then,
zoning.
if we're able to create more high-density housing units in other lands, why would we take our employment lands and make them high-density housing? Does this make sense?
Yes, so I think there's probably it's a two-part answer, and Martha and Karen can correct me if there's more than two parts to the answer. One is the idea that in our commercial corridors, we already have good transit and good infrastructure, good access. And the second one is that the alternative is really to rezone single-family land to high-density land. And then you have the impacts on neighborhoods and the questions about where that would be appropriate. I guess maybe the third option is to take some of our multifamily zones that allow somewhat lower density and just boost that.
That would be a thought. See,
It's-
because everything we do, it's like grabbing, your Jell-O or your balloon here. You grab it here and it's here, and you grab it here and it puffs up over here. So let's say that we put all of these, let's say that we go with this proposal and we develop our commercial lands into high-density residential lands or whatever you want to do, housing. Well, people have to get in jobs, so what do? They get in their cars on our very depleted roadways and they start traveling and we have congestion. So one action creates another problem in another area, and we're all working very hard on more transportation projects in Clackamas County, but my feeling is that the housing situation is going to increase faster than our road capacity to be able to handle people exiting out of the county for jobs. That's why if we're able to create high-density housing in another area, yeah, it's going to be in residential. Yeah, you know what? There's probably going to be a little resistance, but we have got to really think about jobs while we move forward on this housing. Commissioner Savas?
Yeah, I just want to say, to staff's comments, and I'm not arguing at all, they're right. Some of this commercial zoning allows for housing on it, and the reason it's not housing today is frankly because of market. So you have a need for housing, but the market says, to make it pencil, you need to have all these things. And so asking us or government or wherever else to waive some of those things is fine where I think it's probably appropriate, but the question is, should it have negative impacts? For example, if you waive parking and you waive the requirements, you make it economically more feasible, but as long as there's no adverse effects or consequences to that, great. But in reality, if you see where some of these are, for example, by waiving parking, they're car-lined streets with inadequate parking, and the businesses can't get any customers in there because anyone driving by can't even park. So, that's why the economics it's tricky, and I think that a lot of folks don't understand the market situation, or the market realities. And so I think that opportunities where there's fallow land, if you will, that's green, what they call it, greenfields, another term is greenfields. You have the greatest opportunity for creating those kinds of environments versus that redevelopment model. Granted, HB 2001 and HB 2003, it's changing the dynamic a little bit. If the market makes it work, great. But the last thing I want to see, for example, is in a housing residential area where we already have safety concerns as far as people walking, is street-lined cars and no sidewalks and no safe place to walk. So kids have to walk in the travel lane to go down the street. Mm-hmm. That's not safe. So we need to be thoughtful, and that's what planners do. They're very thoughtful. They take in all of these things, we're tweaking an old model here, and we got to be really careful about when we start tweaking.
And I think we all can take a look at some of the developments in downtown Portland where they built these high-rises with no parking. You know, each unit probably has a minimum of 2 cars, because it usually have 2 people, you know, in a household working with kids. So I'm concerned about the parking as well. We've got to have parking, and it can't be on street. We can't be taking the parking from the commercial zones, from their businesses either, because that is a big piece. People won't visit. If I go to the store, for instance, if I'm in, let's use downtown Oregon City. Parking is easily available now because of COVID, and there's not the activity. But before COVID, it was really hard to find a place to park if I wanted to visit one of the restaurants, for instance, at lunch. Man, where do you go? And that isn't even, that's not a housing area. That's all business down there. So I don't know how we get around that one, Martha. You know what? That's for you brainiacs to work on. You guys are smarter than we are. We're just like over here pontificating about what we think. So if I see no other lights on, no other commissioners, would you please continue?
Yes, thank you. And I will, and we will move on to parking in just a moment. You all are stealing my thunder here a little bit. So anyway, moving back to commercial, housing and commercial zones, and I'll be brief and wrap this section up. We had the online survey, and we had these conversations with the various organizations and with our technical working group, and it became very apparent that just completely removing maximum densities in commercial areas was really not something that was generally supported and didn't seem like a particularly good idea. There generally was support for increasing the density, although, you know, what number you increase it to is there's no magic number. Staff has a proposal. It's certainly not set in stone. And, you know, there were concerns certainly about removing the maximum density related to what it would do to land prices, and suddenly making it inaffordable for somebody to come in and develop affordable housing. But there was definitely support through the survey and through these other organizations. Can you advance the slide, please? I'm not used to having to tell somebody to do that. To increase it somewhat. And so through the survey, we tried to use visual cues, and I always like to be visual too, because you start talking about these things like density, you think, what the heck does it look like, right? Because 100 units an acre sounds really kind of scary and Portlandy. But quite frankly, in 5 stories, as you can see down on the left there, you can do 100 units an acre. The development that you're looking at in sort of on the right-hand side is actually in Clackamas County. That's the development that's behind, I think, the Walmart, right by Fuller Road Station, right off of I-205, and that's between 45 and 50 units an acre, that development. And the top one, I don't know the exact number. And so when we talk about other policy issues aside, when we talk about what the physical development could look like if we were to increase the density to something like a 45 to 60 dwelling units an acre, it's not an extraordinary change from some of the development that we see out there in Clackamas County, and it doesn't go above this sort of 5-story cap that seemed to be the comfort level for a lot of people when they started looking through these pictures. And so I just wanted to visually sort of articulate what this could potentially look like. Next slide.
Are these are rental units? Are they condos you can purchase?
They're rental units. The ones on the right are rental units. I don't know what the top one is, and the bottom one is actually just a mock-up.
So on these examples, Martha, do you know what kind of parking is provided in these examples?
I know what kind of parking is provided on the one on the right. That was actually, that's affordable housing. It's affordable to households earning 60% or below the median income. It's right by a light rail station, and the previous board actually approved a little bit of a parking reduction below our requirements for that development, and I believe it ended up being right about a 0.8 to 1. Jennifer, is that right?
Okay,
Do you remember?
Work on that one.
What?
Right
I
around.
didn't work on that particular one, so I
Okay,
don't
so-
know.
0.8 or 1 to 1, and
So I understand the allowance on that. It's next to the light rail. But in some of these areas we're talking about, light rail won't probably ever be there. And I'm not really sure about the bus routes, if they're that reliable. I mean, I don't know. So I think, whereas I don't mind the looks of these, I understand the need for this type of housing, I think it is imperative that there's a good parking allowance on these.
Okay.
Yeah. Paul?
Just one thing while you have this opportunity, that picture on the right, that's Rosewood, I think it's called Rosewood Station now, it's been changed names a couple times. But we gave a 60-year property tax break. So there's no
Wow.
property taxes for 60 years. And we did that partially because our goal was to transfer some folks out of the Oregon City affordable housing sites to densify that area and make a profitable situation, as you
Got it.
probably know. And that was supposed to be a transition that didn't happen, so.
Okay, well, that's another issue, Paul. Thank you for bringing that up. Martha, can you continue?
Next slide. And this, we don't need to spend any time on this, but, well, maybe we do. So the bright red are really the commercial zones that we are talking about potentially affecting. The maroon actually right now do not have a maximum. And then the other zones that are identified there are commercial zones that don't even allow multifamily housing. So really, the changes, if you were to make them, would be focused only on those bright red areas identified on the map. Next slide. So I'm going to stop talking about this and start talking about parking. So the second strategy was to consider creating a hierarchy of parking, different parking standards based on unit affordability or proximity to transit. What we are talking about here are parking standards for multifamily housing. We are not going to get into parking standards for duplexes or single-family housing or anything like that until phase 2. So we're really talking about multifamily housing. This would be multifamily housing in any zone, in any location that allows for the multifamily housing development. And the issue really is that currently we have a ratio. It's based on the number of bedrooms provided. It ranges from 1 1/4 to 1 3/4 spaces per unit is required for each unit you're proposing to develop. There's no flexibility in our zoning code. And so this is one of the things that the emergency declaration had been used for. And I think that there was a general recognition with the board at the time and with staff that the emergency declaration wasn't necessarily the best way to go around land use and change parking ratios. And so we decided to take a look at what changes could be made in the code to give certainty and fairness to everybody who wanted to come in and develop multifamily housing. And so we also know that parking's expensive and it can affect the affordability of units. And so we looked for a lot of data. This is where we went looking for data to understand really, does the income level or proximity to transit affect how many cars are owned and how much parking is actually being used. And so without getting really deep into the numbers, I mean, the data does show us that really parking is not used as much for lower income households. The actual parking spaces in the parking lots and car ownership is lower, and also show us that there is some reduced usage near light rail stations specifically, although it does not eliminate the need for parking. And so, going out to the public and talking about parking it is a very difficult conversation, as you can imagine. We heard all of the things that you all have started talking about. We don't want negative impacts to neighborhood streets. If we're talking about commercial areas, well, there aren't even really neighborhood streets for people to park on if there's overflow parking. And so I think that we heard loud and clear that parking is a difficult conversation. I think that the data shows us, though, that there may be some instances in which it's appropriate to reduce the parking ratio. And so the recommendations from staff are actually the specific recommendations at this point are buried in the attachments in Part B. But just generally, the recommendation is to slightly reduce the parking ratio, to offer a reduction for affordable housing. And the way that could be structured is you get up to a 20% reduction if you're providing units, say to households at 60% median income or lower, to provide a specific percentage reduction within a quarter mile of a light rail. And then, if the board chooses to provide an alternate path, if somebody really wants to provide data specific to the population or location or what they are building, that could demonstrate that a further reduction is warranted, and then we would review that as part of their land use application when they come in, taking it away from the board and emergency declaration issues. And so that's what staff would propose. Again, specific numbers are listed in here. That's just a proposal out there to talk about. Or we don't need to do anything. And again, that's what we're looking for direction on, is whether or not to move this type of a proposal forward.
Thank you, Martha. So let's make parking discussion not a difficult conversation, okay? Let's just let's put that on the side. Parking is going to be a good discussion, and we're going to embrace it and figure it out. Secondly, it is my intent, I'm going to bring this up at issues next week, that the housing declaration, emergency declaration go away. I'm sick and tired in this county of crisis management. Every time we turn around, we're already under 3 emergency declarations. And by the way, those are real emergency declarations. I do not want the housing declarations to be used as a way to circumvent the laws on the books or our staff's authority to do ever. Instead, commissioners, we're going to have to do the heavy lifting and make some decisions outside of an emergency declaration, because I think that we've had it maybe too easy. We're allowing the emergency declaration to speak for ourselves. And so next week we'll be discussing that, and so I assume that my board will support me in that. We will have to make decisions on zoning, on parking, on the use of commercial, on affordable housing, and how many cars are going to be allowed. Okay? So that's the intent moving forward. Go ahead, Martha.
Thank you. I swear I'm almost done with this. Next slide, please. And again, another map. And so this map is intended to identify all of the areas that allow multifamily housing development. It includes commercial and residentially zoned areas. So these are all of the areas, or all the parcels that would potentially be affected by a change in the parking ratio for multifamily housing. Obviously, to the extent that they're not already developed. I mean, this would be moving forward with new housing. Next slide. And so finally, the third of these strategies, the affordable housing bonus. I mentioned that we have an affordable housing bonus in our zoning code currently. It's pretty minimal and rarely used and very ineffective is just the easiest way to say it. It allows for a developer who's coming in and building affordable units to get 1 extra unit above the base density, up to 8% of the base density. That's it. And so we don't see it being used a lot. There are a lot of other models that are being used in other jurisdictions. Some of them are actually quite complicated, sliding scales for this and that. It would make your head spin. And in fact, when I went and talked to a couple of affordable housing developers, went and talked with some folks at the Housing Oregon Metro Policy Council. It's a group of affordable housing providers. By and large, the message I got was, please make it simple, because developing affordable housing is hard enough and complicated enough. And so I think through our public outreach, through our working group, through the survey, we found that there is support for increasing the affordable housing density bonus. It's sort of an obtuse thing. I don't think anyone really had strong feelings about how to do it or what the number is. And so the staff recommendation is to keep it simple and to just simply increase the maximum density bonus that you're allowed from 8% to 50%. So in other words, if you were building 100 units of affordable housing that was allowed on your property, you could actually get up to 150 units on that site. Again, it would be subject to meeting the parking standards and all of the other development standards if you could fit it on the property.
So what's the cost?
Cost.
Yeah, so if we're giving a builder a bonus that they can have more units, and then maybe I'm not understanding, and Martha, you framed it well. I don't think I have an understanding of what the maximum 50% over base density means. That means they get to have more units.
Yes.
What, for less money?
No?
Okay,
That
more
just
units,
means,
more units for the allowed zoning.
yes,
Okay, and so it's up to the builder to decide how they're going to pay for that.
yes.
All right,
And
That's
how
good
they're going
enough.
to park it, and how they're going to design the site to fit it all.
I don't have a problem with that one, as long as they can meet our parking requirements, whatever those may be. We haven't set those yet.
And again, it's up for discussion what that number is, if we move forward through, an adoption, hearings and adoption process. I imagine there will be more discussion about what that specific number should be and could be. And so, next slide. If we were to move forward with these three, or any combination of these three strategies to look at the zoning code amendments for adoption, we would be looking at a schedule, hopefully, of talking to the Planning Commission about it, doing a work session in May, having a very similar discussion what we're having here, and then set it up for hearings this summer, Planning Commission potentially June, July, and then come before you, the board, in July or August. That is if we get the direction today to move forward with this, which is the question that we're asking for Part B. But before we get to that, there is a fourth strategy. We have not forgotten about it. It is on a different timeline than this. It's not something that has been part of this sort of multifamily package that we've been looking at. And I'm going to pass it off to Jennifer now to.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
So
Touch
you recently actually had a discussion at Issues about transitional housing. Commissioner Fisher had asked to have that discussion after the affordable housing town hall that you had recently, because that issue had been raised. And during Issues, Dan Johnson committed that we would talk to you about that today. I'm more than happy to do that. So transitional housing is really something in between, right? In between houselessness, in between just something that's maybe like camping in a car. I mean, I guess it could, that's a little more about emergency housing. But not talking about, building affordable housing complexes. So it could be some kind of tiny home village, or some, I think it's the city of Eugene has some models that Commissioner
Like our
Savas
Veterans Village, for instance.
Yes, exactly, like the Vets Village, perfect. So we do have some history with that in Clackamas County, the Vets Village being the prime example. The county actually did zoning code amendments to enable the Vets Village, but those amendments had limited applicability. They were only applicable in industrial zones, urban industrial zones, and only applicable to publicly owned property. And it was really with the Vets Village site in mind, and the idea of trying that and seeing how it worked. And they sunsetted. So those regulations were in effect for 2 years, and then they automatically went away. So at the moment, we don't have anything in our zoning code that really speaks to transitional housing. It is something we've seen some interest in, particularly from various faith-based communities and from our partners in H3S, to be able to provide for that in some way. But currently, there are no clear pathways in the zoning code. The prior board did launch something, for want of a better term, that I'll call a pilot project, which was the idea, before we amend our zoning code, let's test this out. Let's reach out to, it was actually the faith-based community that we reached out to, and see if there's an interest in providing even as something as simple as car camping in a parking lot. We didn't have any takers for a long time, but ultimately, the King of Kings Lutheran Church did submit an application, and it suffice to say the process did not go well. It was a temporary permit. That was what our code provided for, where you had really, it's a temporary permit to do something you can't otherwise do. The public process was, I think everyone would say, painful on all sides, for neighbors, for the applicant, for staff. And ultimately it was approved, but with some very burdensome conditions, and the church elected not to move forward. So after that, then we turned to the idea of the emergency declaration. The board at the time did consider using the emergency declaration in certain circumstances for things like warming shelters, where maybe it wasn't an allowed use necessarily, but on the coldest nights of the year, you allow that use in a church facility or some other structure. And for the possibility of doing some car camping, again, I think often on church sites. DTD really wasn't the lead on that. H3S, I think, came before the board on a couple of occasions at least over the last couple of years to pursue that. They would coordinate with us, confirm that, that it required the use of the emergency declaration, and then move that forward. I don't know that that's still happening. I haven't gotten a request in a long time.
I'm going to stop you right here, Jennifer. Gary, I want you to check on the emergency declaration used for warming shelters. Why? I mean, when we get this really cold weather, I see churches popping up all the time providing warming shelters. Now, is there a need beyond what the churches provide for the county to do that in some of our localities? For instance, like West Lynn, we established quickly a warming shelter upon the mayor's request within a day in their town, in their city. But we were under an emergency declaration then. I think if a warming shelter is needed, why do we need an emergency declaration to do it, is my question for counsel, legal counsel, or maybe I don't know. So I think moving forward, we'll need an answer on that one, keeping in mind that the emergency declaration for housing will probably go away. I don't want to put anybody on the spot trying to answer that now. Thank you for bringing that up, Jennifer. Please proceed.
And I'm just about done here, but I think what you said earlier actually really resonated with me about the emergency declaration and its use for essentially waiving the zoning code. It's not a great long-term solution for permanent types of development. It works, something like COVID, where we're granting somebody the ability to put dining pods in a parking lot while the COVID, that's different. But if you're talking about being able to provide a certain pathway for people to do transitional shelters, whatever those end up looking like, whether it's a warming shelter, whether it's car camping, whether it's a tiny home village, whether it's something like Vets Village, amending the zoning code, I think, is the appropriate mechanism to do that. So we haven't had any discussions with the board in any recent times about what that would look like. What would you be in support of? Where would we put those? Under what criteria? But that's really what this strategy, this transitional housing strategy, is about. And so we're not really planning to do a big discussion of that today. But it had come up at issues and wanted to just basically touch base and say, yes, this is on our list. And if the board is interested in having that discussion and continuing with that strategy, we're more than happy to do that.
I would like to take the transitional housing piece out of what we're being asked today, and we'll consider that separately under a different type of criteria. And the number one criteria for that is availability of land and how we're going to pay for it and how we're going to offer wraparound services, which I think you cannot offer transitional housing without an H3S discussion. So I'm going to ask respectfully if we can take the transitional housing piece out of this presentation and out of any motions that we will be granting today. Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess one other note is that the state may be taking action on this at the state level, and so there may be some legislation coming, and we can circle back.
Thank you, Jennifer. Paul, I see your light on. Paul, were you clicking your light earlier?
Clicking it?
Were you clicking it because it just now popped on, and I don't
No, I just turned it on just now.
Okay, good. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, I think that the housing crisis that we have isn't going to go away. And so having an emergency ordinance is going to get worn out. It's not going to emergency. It's a status quo. What's upon us now is a status quo. So I think that overuse of this emergency ordinance is something that we could probably get in trouble for, actually. I don't disagree that maybe today is not the right time to have the transitional shelter discussion, but I think it's something that we have to have in the very near future. I think it's important that we have it and that we actually factor it in any decision that we make. We can't ignore this one. I think that the Veterans Village was a pilot. We did it. Transition does work if it's managed correctly, and I'm a proponent of that. So if you look at the amount of people we transitioned from the veteran shelter into permanent housing and where others it's worked, I think it's a vital, there's a huge need for it. So we need to figure out a way to make it work, but I don't want to put it off too far. I think it needs to be part of the full picture.
Yeah, but I'm having trouble making decisions on transitional housing because of the nature of the beast without having the support services that go around it. And I don't think we can, Paul, I agree with you. I think they need to be considered jointly with H3S and DTD to go forward on that. And I think that's a good holistic approach. I think we get there. So when you're looking through to me, transitional housing has many lenses. It's just not affordable housing. It's just not market housing. It's really its own beast. And we did create a model in the veterans place. And so I just think that we will get to it when we get to it and when time allows. We have a lot of heavy lifting to do right now on a lot of areas. And I'm not saying that traditional housing is not important, but I think we really need to consider it thoughtfully. Who's up next? Martha, do you need to continue?
So I think we're just transitioning into your discussion, which obviously you've already raised a lot of the significant issues. We are looking for direction from the board today for Part B, which we're now concluding our presentation on. And we want to know if you want, and the options are on page 7 of your worksheet, but essentially we're suggesting that you direct staff to move the 3 Phase 1 strategies to the Planning Commission and public hearings process for adoption and continue working on the transitional shelter component. And so that's the increasing the maximum density in commercial zones, reducing parking requirements for multifamily, and changing our affordable housing density bonus. Those are the 3 that Martha highlighted. And so the question is, does the board want us to move forward with those or not?
Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to take a 5-minute recess, because I think the board has offered up, and certainly the people at this dais have offered up what we want to see considered going to the Planning Commission and to the public. And what we said today needs to be incorporated into these motions. So we're going to take a 5-minute recess, take a comfort break, breathe a little bit, and think. Okay.
Perfect.
We are back from our brief pause. I think this is a very fascinating technical decision that takes a lot of consideration. I think the decisions that we're making on this will live in the future for generations, frankly. And with that in mind, Gary, you have a recommendation.
I do, Chair. Thank you. Commissioners, you've raised some fantastic suggestions, some amazing talking points, and really, you're right. This is a long-standing issue that prior boards have talked about for 10 years, and these decisions will last a long, long time. So my recommendation is, based on the feedback you've shared today, let's take a pause, a short pause, and allow staff to consider what you've already shared, to conduct one-on-one meetings with you, commissioners, not a decision point, but to hear further feedback that you may individually have. Commissioner Schrader is also not
There's
here.
a complaint about no sound right now.
I am looking at it right now.
I'm saying such amazing things, too. Oh, it's so sad. I'll hold just a second.
I think we have it fixed.
Is it fixed? Does that work? Thumbs up. Can you hear me online?
Sonia?
Was Sonia the only one that couldn't hear?
Anyone
No,
on
no,
Zoom?
others as well.
Anyone on
Yep,
Zoom?
they can
Okay.
hear now.
All right. I was so eloquent what I said. It was just beautiful. People are crying with tears of joy. All right. My suggestion, commissioners, this is such an important topic. You've given fantastic feedback today. Let's take a short pause, not make a decision today. Allow staff to meet with you, commissioners, individually, one-on-one, to hear any further input or feedback you may have. Use that to refine any recommendations, bring it back to you in a shorter session where we then you can make a decision of what to send to the Planning Commission. It's too important. There's amazing feedback you provided. I don't think you're ready today to move forward. Let's do those one-on-ones first and then come back.
And I want to say, I do not want to diminish the effort put on staff, because I think we have some pretty intelligent staff people in the room here today presenting this information. And, it's up to the commissioners to get up to your level, to get up to your understanding of this, frankly. We had one-on-ones on 2 other really hard topics, and it worked uber well. So you should look forward to the great opportunity of the FaceTime you get with each commissioner. Thank you with that. I see a red light, Christina.
Commissioner Fisher has a
Commissioner Fisher, you're up.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Smith. I really support us taking a pause here. One thing that I would really like better understanding of is the intense work that staff did with the community in coming up with these staff recommendations. I have been in touch with the Home Builders Association. They've been very informative to my understanding of what the issues are and the importance of the issues. I'm not sure about the level of input from others, and I really want to understand where our community is. So I really support taking a pause on this, having us get more information before we take next steps. So thank you.
Chair, if I may.
Yes, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I just want to I was asking staff a question during the break, and I think it's something that we need to consider, each of the commissioners and staff, just to be thoughtful about it. And that is this issue about the parking and why we're different. I made the comment to staff, if I was a commissioner in Multnomah County, I would have a different opinion here today about what we're doing and how we do it, per se. And that is because it's so walkable. It's flat. There's a lot of transit multimodal options. You can walk. They have everything there. I mean, frankly, it's just rich in multimodal options. But we don't have that here. We have topography challenges. And there was a great transit discussion, congestion pricing panel, and the link is going to be coming out any day now, that took place. I think Commissioner Scholl, you listened in on part of that on Thursday morning. It was a JPAC sponsored kind of an event. So I think people should really watch that, because the comments were made about how to put or push out transit and make it more effective in suburban areas. And it was actually a question that I had actually proffered, and also Metro Councilor Lewis also proffered. And they talk about the last mile being the distance between your home and transit or a transit line. And, the comment was made, and Councilor Lewis made this comment, the last mile really, where we are in Clackamas County, is really the last 5 miles. And the topography challenges magnifies that significantly. So in reality, and some of these speakers, panels, it was an awesome panel. I mean, it was a great discussion. People ought to watch it. But what it really exposed was their recommendation is, in order to make it work, you need to have park and rides. You need to be able to have parking so people can drive their car from wherever they are, whether it's 5 miles away from a transit line or whether it's up a hill that's only a mile away, to a parking place so they can use transit. So we need to be really thoughtful from a larger scope about what areas we are, what those challenges are, and how we accommodate practical needs for people. And I want to bring the needs, I'm not going to expand too farther on this, but we need to make sure we understand what the needs are versus what the economics are.
Okay. When you on your one-on-one, go for it, Paul. It needs to be really understandable for everybody. This is housing discussion. It's really not a transit discussion or a transportation discussion, but. Okay, Gary, anything else today?
Yes, so there is still one more section of this staff report where it's just an update, not a decision. So if you
Sure.
agree, I'd like to
We're here,
let
go.
staff finish that last part, please.
Thank you. And I do look forward to meeting with all of you one-on-one. I do, and we all do realize this is a lot to be throwing at everybody in one planning session. My brain has been working on it for a year, and for some of you, this is the first time you've heard about it. So I get that, and we're happy to continue this conversation. So I am just going to go briefly through some of the Phase 2 strategies. Can you advance the slide, please? As was mentioned, there are 3 two-phase strategies. They are largely strategies that are required under state law. First is House Bill 2001, which was passed in 2019, which requires middle housing. It's called the Middle Housing Bill. It requires duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, cottage clusters, and townhomes be allowed in urban single-family zoned areas. It is required, and there are deadlines, and so we have started some work on that, which I will summarize briefly in a moment. There's also Senate Bill 1051, which was passed in 2017, that requires all housing have clear and objective standards to be approved. And so we have not taken a comprehensive look at our zoning code yet to make the changes that are necessary to comply with that. And since we know that that has to be done, we decided to wrap that into our comprehensive look of our single-family zones to deal with the middle housing bill. And then finally, looking at some of the plan policies in some of the policies in our comprehensive plan as they relate to rezoning these lower density areas. There were some issues that had come up that we were trying to address. Again, packaging all of these together because they largely affect the same geographic area, the same zoning districts, and to some extent the same sections of our zoning code and comprehensive plan. Next slide. So the first strategy, House Bill 2001, middle housing. Again, I mentioned duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhomes, and cottage clusters. These are some interesting sort of visual depictions of what this kind of housing is. Typically, when we talk about missing middle housing or middle housing, it's that it's not apartments. They could be considered apartments if it's a fourplex, but it's these sort of smaller, either for rent or for sale, sort of naturally more affordable type housing to middle income households, not subsidized affordable housing, not detached single family housing. It's the stuff in between. Next slide. And so I mentioned that House Bill 2001 requires the county to allow in its urban unincorporated areas these different middle housing types. It specifically requires that we allow a duplex on every single lot that's zoned, urban lot that's zoned for single family, for a detached single family home. And then it requires that we allow for the other middle housing types, the triplexes, quads, et cetera, in areas zoned for detached single family homes, which inevitably brings up the question of what are in areas, and that is something that we still are hashing out to some extent. There was rulemaking done. The part of the House bill requirements were that the Department of Land Conservation and Development the state do rulemaking, and part of that rulemaking was try to put parameters around how we define these areas. I was actually involved in some of the rulemaking as an alternate, and it was a long process, and ultimately both a model code that a jurisdiction could use, was developed, and then the rules that outline these various parameters that jurisdictions have to work within if they're writing their own codes. It does not, quite frankly, afford us a whole lot of flexibility. And so we are working on looking at really where we have flexibility in our code writing. And as we move forward with our implementation of House Bill 2001, I am sure we will have a lot more conversations with you all. And we will certainly be having a lot of conversations with the public. It's important to keep in mind that these new rules don't forbid single-family homes. That was in the paper, I think, for a while. It's just adding more choices. If somebody has a lot zoned for single-family dwelling now, and they are suddenly allowed to build these other housing types, they're not required to. You could still build a single-family home if you wanted to. And then we do have a deadline to comply. It's June 30th of 2022, which in 2019 seemed really far off, and now it doesn't. And so what happens if we don't comply, if we don't change our code by June 30th, 2022? We have to use the model code. It is imposed on us. And so we have started some work. I mean, I think there are some really good pieces of the model code that we would like to look at, but we would like to move forward with creating our own regulations that are appropriate for our own communities and neighborhoods.
Martha, real quick,
Oh, yeah.
on considering House Bill 2001, the middle housing, has there been much overall objection to the concept, or is the objection in that it's not flexible?
I think it depends on who you're talking to. We have just started our public outreach, and at this point, it's more of an educational piece about what this is. And so we don't have a real good sense. I mean, we've heard lots of opinions.
Okay, so considering this concept that's now a law that we must implement. Do you want the commissioners to pass this Phase 2 Strategy 1 implementation with this package, with the package that's presented here today?
No, this is really informational for you, to give you a
Okay.
heads up that this is
So
coming.
that would be a separate policy session as we move forward.
Yes.
So let's take that outside of this, along with the traditional housing is outside of what your one-on-ones are
Yes.
going to be. Does that make sense? Is
Yes.
that a better clarification for staff? It certainly is for me. Okay, thank you, Martha. And I do think this is important. Personally, I like the concept. I mean, the devil's always in the details, but I think this addresses a whole huge niche out there. We could also call it workforce housing if you wanted. Paul?
Yeah, two things I wanted to, and what really triggered it was I think the first slide perhaps about those other types. And so two things. One is, for a moment, we can talk about other types in the sense that, manufactured housing is a big market, and most of the affordable housing in the United States is manufactured housing. I know that some people think about it as a trailer with tires underneath it, and like an old RV, but it's really far more advanced than that today. And there's some great examples of well-designed manufactured housing parks in Clackamas County and throughout the region. So it's very affordable, and there's also opportunities for people to have ownership in some of these models where a land trust buys it, and so people don't have to pay a rent in perpetuity. So I want to put that out there, that all that zoning in the urban area is used up. So that could be something that we could perhaps entertain somewhere. Sometimes cities don't like that. But while I'm on the city piece, is that our maps and our housing plan, we looked at the entire county, cities included. And I think that this, to some degree, I'm not saying for our planning commission by any means, but I think in the greater picture, in the greater context at C4, a number of opportunities that we need to be cognizant and be working together of what the cities are going to be doing, hopefully something, to accommodate the housing needs. It can't just be unincorporated Clackamas County, and what we can do cooperatively. So that's number one. Number two is, you probably heard last Wednesday night at the meeting, one of the first speakers at the Park Avenue meeting was a speaker that spoke to the vertical housing option. And I'm all for adding flexibility. I'm all for adding incentives that don't have negative consequences. But there's an opportunity where it adds something. It really doesn't take away much of anything. So that might be something that can help overcome the economics of parking when you add a different incentive. So that ought to be something that we ought to consider. And I know that we discussed it as Takeda. I really encourage to look at the math of that. It's not, I think maybe there might have been a misunderstanding of what that math is and the impacts. They were, in my opinion, that they're negligible. And I think when you look at that, if it's done correctly, it's an add, it's a benefit. So I just want to put those two things out there for discussion, for fodder in the future.
Thank you, Paul. Sonia Fisher.
Thank you, Chair Smith. Sort of piggybacking on what Paul was saying, he kind of took what I was going to ask about, but I'm curious. I think coordination with our cities is absolutely critical, not on just this 2001, but on the topics that we discussed previously. What's happening with that? How are we including our cities in this conversation? I do know that, gosh, it's probably been a couple of years ago now. I'm not remembering exactly when we did it, but when we pulled C4 together and talked about all the different tools for housing with our different representatives from the cities and unincorporated areas, it was a very robust, constructive conversation. And so I don't want to lose that focus. Curious what our plan is in that regard.
Jennifer, do you have a comment?
So regarding our housing strategies, which is really what this project is, there really isn't, we don't see a role necessarily for cities. Not to say we don't talk to other jurisdictions, we do, but we are all independently required to come into compliance with House Bill 2001. Cities have even some additional requirements beyond unincorporated areas, not under HB 2001, but under some other housing legislation. So local jurisdictions are working on this. That we're certainly not in a vacuum. The housing needs analysis that really came out of C4 was countywide, as I think Commissioner Savas mentioned. A number of our cities participated in that. The data, though, the 5,000 unit shortage, that is specific to unincorporated Clackamas County. Cities all got their own numbers.
And thank you for that. I think on this particular strategy, we will concentrate on unincorporated Clackamas County housing needs and the 5,000 units that we're deficit in. If any commissioner wants to talk about the cities, I don't see how we're going to have cities come into this discussion at this time for this particular need. However, there may be other needs in times when the cities can be offer their input in that. We, commissioners, I'm really trying to get us focused on this. That's why I want to remove the emergency declaration. That's why I want to set aside the transitional housing and the middle housing component as well, so we can narrow in our focus and concentrate on the housing needs as Jennifer has talked about. Thank you. Staff.
Did you want?
Chair, one thing I want to just say is that this conversation covers a lot of disciplines and transportation, transit, but the one I think I want to highlight here is that it'd be great if our housing authority staff were part of this conversation, even though they don't see maybe they don't see a relationship today, but I think there is a relationship. And I think the discussion and the policies that what we're talking about, is applicable to what we're doing on that front as well. So I'm hoping, this is recorded, obviously, our staff can listen to it, but it seems to me that when we talk about the transitional piece, which I don't really want to defer for too long, that's more in their wheelhouse.
That's right,
to
it's more
some
in
degree.
H3S, I would agree.
But I don't see it, I'm looking around the room here today, and I'm looking who's in the participants list on the Zoom part, and this seems to be pretty focused.
Well,
with
Paul,
DTV
because it was
today.
intentional that way. Now, Commissioners Savas and Fisher, if you want to bring in all these component groups, we'll be having this discussion in December, maybe
not talking
next
about the-
January.
Chair, I'm not
Just
talking
let
about
me finish. Let me finish. Now, this is very specific to land use zoning, that we may need to make decisions on the zoning. Then, if we want to bring into the services, this is how I envision, because like the staff said, this board has been, debating this for 10 years. And we can keep debating it for as long as my board wants to, as long as my board wants to defer a decision into the future on this, by bringing in all the other entities, and then when we do that, board, that no decision is made, because we're trying to appease to everybody who has an opinion out there, and it's just not going to be possible on the question that has been posed to us today. Just letting you know that. I mean, we have this conversation in affordable housing all the time with H3S. We've had the Metro Bond. We had the turnkey project, and that went afoul. We've had this, and we've had this, but this is a zoning matter. And we need to be focused on the zoning, correct, Gary?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Staff.
Yes, next slide. The second strategy that we're going to be looking at in Phase 2 is Senate Bill 1051 compliance. Again, like I mentioned, Senate Bill 1051 requires that all Oregon jurisdictions have a clear and objective path for all types of housing. This will require a pretty comprehensive audit of our development standards and potentially some changes. Some of them are going to be very easy. It will, unfortunately, bring up a few policy decisions that the board is going to have to make through this process. And again, we have started making lists of where changes might need to be made in our zoning code, but we are just starting, and we will certainly bring this back to you. It is important to keep in mind that Senate Bill 1051 also allows for a discretionary path if it's an optional path. And so you can have, as long as you have a clear and objective path, you can also have something else. And so we will be discussing that again.
Is there a deadline on 1051? Does anybody know?
Jennifer?
It's already in effect. So the reality of it is that when a developer comes in and applies now, we have to essentially waive or ignore any provisions of our code that are not clear and objective unless they're optional. So we're already implementing it, but the problem is it's not, our code our code doesn't say that, so we need to get our code caught up with the law.
So that, to me, sounds like it's a higher priority in our zoning than maybe some other.
It's a high priority. It's also a lot of work, which is why we've mapped out this plan to get this done over this
And what's your
next-
plan for implementing 1051 in our codes?
So our plan is to do it at the same time as we do the HB 2001 work, because they affect, in many cases, the same zones. We'll be talking to a lot of the same people, amending a lot of the same sections of the code. So it's efficient to do them at the same time.
Okay,
So that's the
works for
plan.
me. I like it.
Next, please. And then the final strategy is, at the same time, looking at policies in our comprehensive plan for rezoning low-density residential land. This came about due to a decision from LUBA, from Land Use Board of Appeals, that really changed the way that we evaluate zone changes, and there was some community interest in the work plan development about looking at these policies and potentially making some changes. You know, then, of course, whatever changes we make be due to House Bill 2001 and Senate Bill 1051 are going to directly relate. And so we will, again, spend more time bringing the details about this back to you in the future. But this is phase 2, and it's on a different time frame than the phase 1 that we spent so much time talking about. But at a minimum, our zone change requirements that are in the comprehensive plan do need to be clarified. And so I'll just leave that at that. Next one, please. And so what have we done so far on phase 2? I said we're at the very beginning. I was involved in the House Bill 2001 rulemaking. We initially, when we started looking at housing strategies, put these items in phase 2 because we didn't know what the rules were going to be yet. And so we wanted to wait for the rulemaking to finish, which did in December of 2020. So now we understand really what the playing field is, and now we can move forward. At the same time, DLCD offered some technical assistance grants, and we had applied for one of those technical assistance grants to hire some consultants to help us with the outreach portion of House Bill 2001. And we ended up hiring 2 different consultant teams, one to help really develop the sort of broader public outreach plan, the other one really to focus on the culturally specific communities and communities that we typically don't reach when we are trying to get feedback on land use issues, and try to get a broader cross-section of people involved, and hopefully start building these relationships so as we move forward, we can keep them involved. And so those consultants have a strict timeline. I think we talked about this, or Dan had talked to you about this maybe at Issues a week or 2 ago. That work has begun because our grant funding has a specific timeline, and our consultants have to do their work by the end of June. And then we don't have them anymore, which doesn't mean we're going to stop the outreach. It just means we're going to take what they have started and build off of it, and build off of these relationships that they're helping us forge with certain community members. And then finally, under House Bill 2001, there was a provision. There was an allowance for areas that did not have sufficient water, sewer, stormwater, or transportation infrastructure to handle the addition of these middle housing types, and there was an opportunity for a time extension, and it's called an infrastructure-based time extension, or IBTR for short. There was a lot of rulemaking involved around what exactly that meant and how you would qualify for and apply for one. Chris Story, Assistant Director of WES, was involved in that, and he unfortunately couldn't make it today. So I'll do my best to field questions if you have them specific about the IBTR. It turned out to be very narrowly defined, and so the criteria turned out to be very narrowly defined in order to qualify for a time extension. And so back in February, we reached out to all of our urban service providers of water, sewer, and storm water, and asked them if they had any concerns in any areas that they served related to the slow addition of middle housing into their communities. and whether or not that raised any service concerns. And if they had areas that they identified, we would work with them to see if it was something that would qualify for this IBTR. And of the service providers that we heard back from, we did not hear that there were any concerns. And I can say that it's partly because of because of the narrow rules. It's really just a 2-year look, and you are not allowed to assume a very big rate of infill development. And so this really tiny increment of development that was expected to occur because of the addition of middle housing. So in other words, they had to demonstrate that they could serve a single-family home if it was put there, but not, say, a duplex or a triplex. And it's such a small increment that none of the service providers indicated that they would have any concerns that would meet those standards. And so therefore, we are not going to be applying for an IBTR for any sub-areas within our urban area. This was never intended to be like an entire jurisdictional thing or even a whole service district. It was intended to be allowed for specific areas. The deadline for applying for an IBTR is June 30th of this year, and which is why we reached out to our service providers, because it's heavily data-based and we're not the experts. We wanted them to tell us if the data tells them that they had some infrastructure problem that would meet these specific standards. And so that's what we have done to date with Phase 2. It's really focused on House Bill 2001, again, because of the grant and also because of our deadline for making our code amendments and our deadline for if we were going to apply for this infrastructure-based time extension. Next slide. And then our consultants are actually creating some really great materials, and we're going to be putting together they're putting together a web page for us. And one of the things that they developed was this timeline, which outlines our public engagement and then the timeline for House Bill 2001 code development that shows their engagement ending this summer, but then, of course, the public engagement continuing throughout the whole process. Another thing that they put together was in your packet. This is really pretty frequently asked questions about House Bill 2001. I encourage you to read it as you want to learn more about House Bill 2001, because I think it's visual and it's well put together and well thought out. And that's my plug for that. And I think, next slide. That's it for my presentation on Phase 2.
Good. And, okay, do you have Part C, Phase 2? Is that yet to come?
This was Part C, Phase 2.
Okay, is that it for the entire presentation
Yes.
today? Thank you. Commissioner Savas.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think the meeting went well today. I appreciate the way you managed the meeting today, so I want to make sure that the comments that I make now are not a reflection on this, and don't take it the wrong way. I want to just go back to the comments I made about H3S, and I'm not, or not H3S, but the Housing Authority. Wasn't suggesting that they be part of the discussion or part of the presentation by any means, but that they ought to be.
Thank you.
They ought to be, so to speak, focusing in on this, and that's why I mentioned the recording, that they can still focus in on this and learn from what we've discussed here today. The other element of that I spoke to, with transportation and transit and all these other external things. Staff did a great job putting the packet together. I don't have any criticisms. I wouldn't change anything other than how we look and act and what we do going forward. I mentioned the cities, and I think, granted, that's where it gets a little interesting and sticky. So Goal 10, which is the requirement for housing, is on the cities, not the county. Historically, the cities have complained the county shouldn't be in the urban service delivery business, and yet here we are doing something that has and feels and looks and is very urban service-like. The cities, if we allow this to continue and and the unincorporated area takes the entire burden, and we're not, because there are cities that are participating in housing, so I don't want to have any city hear this and not understand that there are some cities that have stepped up to the plate. But if we allow all of the all of these willing areas, unincorporated, to take the entire burden here, that's really going to create some differing communities, if you will, and city charters, and how city charters and perhaps what the League of Oregon Cities does with respect to challenging anything with regard to HB 2001 is something that yet to be seen, because some cities they're probably not going to comply. They're going to figure out a way to wiggle out of it. It means we pick up the burden. If a city doesn't step up, I don't care what county they're in, it really doesn't matter. This is not specific to Clackamas County, but if we're not cognizant of that and understand all those dynamics in marketplace, then we could really be subjecting our taxpayers and our citizens of this county to a completely different livability, quality of life situation, right? And that applies to transit, because transit doesn't go around cities, it goes through our communities, it goes through. That has to be part of this whole discussion. But I really think, again, back to my comment about H3S and transportation and all that, we've encouraged our staff not to work in silos. We've encouraged our staff to work across the silos and work together. And the Veterans Village and the housing group that Commissioner Schrader and I sat on was a great example of working across those silos. So we've encouraged that. So I think that we ought to be again, I wouldn't change the setting here today, but going forward with the discussion of transitional housing, with all these factors, it educates us, it informs us, and basically our decisions are based on our information. So we need to make informed decisions, and I think we need to look at this going forward more holistically across all these disciplines and factor all these things in, because the decisions we make are going to have permanent impacts to this county. Thank you.
Commissioner Fisher.
Thank you, Chair Smith. I just want to reiterate what Paul is saying, because honestly, this issue is a continuum, and you have to look from all areas of need, from people who are unsheltered all the way into making sure that we have executive housing in Clackamas County. And I don't want us to miss an opportunity. There is so much momentum, not only in Clackamas County, the state, actually the whole nation around this issue. We have the structures in place through C4 to solidify the conversation. And if we are going to move forward on what may be considered a best practice in Clackamas County, we have an opportunity for leadership with our other jurisdictions. And what kind of Clackamas County do we want to see for our entire community? We really don't want to miss that opportunity of coordinating with our cities. So
Whatever.
That's just my 2 cents at this point.
That's fine, whatever. But I'm gonna say this again, commissioners, and you really need to listen. It starts with the land. You don't have the availability of the land and the infrastructure, the zoning laws in place. You can talk all day long about our partners in the cities, about our wraparound services, about reducing silos, but this, I believe, this here today is where it starts for all of our housing needs. And if you want to go down that path, I tell you what, we're going to get bogged down in minutia and detail ad infinitum. So Gary, how is our time on this? Have we finished for today?
You have 7 minutes left, but if you're done, that's fine.
I think we're done. And staff, reach out to all the commissioners, to Gary, whatever you need, and let's get our education up to speed on this for all of us, what's required, what the priorities are. And by the time we meet again soon, we'll have, I think, have a good handle on this. Thank you very much for all your hard work. It has not gone unrecognized, by the way. Thank you, and we are adjourned for today.